All right, a few thank yous before I introduce our speaker today. First of all, thank you to everybody for coming out on a Friday afternoon. These are historically the beginning, every Friday is the beginning of a 3-day weekend at universities. The fact that you're here is moving to me. Thank you for being here. And I think you'll be rewarded richly by our speaker. Secondly, I want to thank Jim Faulkner and those who created, donors who created the Richard L. Evans Chair of Religious Understanding for helping to sponsor this event. That was terrific. In fact, the idea to bring Professor Critchley here was David Laraway's, chair of our Spanish and Portuguese department, and also Jim Faulkner, who has known Simon for some 30 years almost. So thank you to Jim and to the Evans Chair of Religious Understanding. Second thank you, or third thank you, I guess, is to John Rosenberg, the Dean of our College of Humanities, for his vision in creating the Humanities Center. And for his support of all the activities, the events, the initiatives that we sponsor in the center. It's tremendous support, and we're very grateful. I'm going to introduce our speaker, Simon Critchley, and it's an enormous pleasure to do this, and a real privilege to have Simon here. I mean, he's in very high demand, and the fact that he's here with us is quite the honor. Simon Critchley is the Hans Jonas Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York City. He's a product of the English university system. He earned his BA and PhD from the University of Essex, MA, meanwhile, down in Nice. So he got away 1 year down the Riviera, went back up. And after a 1-year appointment at Cardiff University, he actually began working as a professor also at the University of Essex. While he was at Essex, he published his first book, and that book is called The Ethics of Deconstruction, subtitled Derrida and Levinas. This is a 1992 book. Now, you know you've written a really good book when what you write in that book seems 20 years later like common sense, but at the time seemed counterintuitive. And what was great about the book and the timing for the book is that the ethical turn in deconstruction is very evident if you read carefully. But in the early 90s, when there was kind of air still of scandals surrounding Paul de Man and et cetera, the deconstruction was seen largely as being kind of an enemy to meaning, or wonderful because it did sort of undermine meaning. And Simon approached deconstruction not from the standpoint of signification, but from the standpoint of ethics. And it's a very, very good book. And since then, he's written a great number of books, and a few have been translated into multiple languages. And these books, I won't read them all, but I'll include a couple here. His book On Humor, published in 2002, has been translated into 11 different languages. His book Infinitely Demanding, a 2007 book, translated into 8 languages. The Book of Dead Philosophers from 2008, 17 different languages. The Faith of the Faithless is a book that's 2012, which is a terrific book. We had a seminar yesterday on that book here in our college. And then most recently, the book Stay Illusion, The Hamlet Doctrine, published just last year, which he co-authored with his wife, Jamison Webster. He's one of the major voices in continental philosophy and theory, and he'll be leading a seminar this summer, as a matter of fact, at the Cornell School of Criticism and Theory. And while he's been a wonderful and a very gracious guest, and he's met with faculty for a seminar, and he sat down today for an interview, actually Thinking Aloud interview. He broadcast, I'll tell you, next Thursday, the 27th. It's on actually 7 p.m. on BYU Radio on Sirius XM and at 8 o'clock p.m. on Classical 89. And we've taped that, also videotaped it for our Humanities Center webpage. So if you want to see it, as opposed to just hearing it, you can look at our webpage in about a week or so. I imagine it should be up, maybe 2 weeks. Anyway, it's a great, great pleasure to have Simon with us. And his title of his talk is Tragedies, Philosophy, which sounds very provocative. So please join me in welcoming Simon Critchley.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Matt. And thank you for the introduction. I remember saying something very nice about someone that I liked some years ago, and he said, "I'm pleased that you see what you see, and I'm pleased that you don't see what I see." And so I tend to see introductions in that light. So I'm very happy to be back at BYU. I was here in 1994. Gave a series of 3 lectures on romanticism, which it was a very important few days for me. And I've got old friends here, Jim Faulkner, and newer friends like David Laraway and Matt, and people like Travis Anderson I've known for years. So I'm very happy to be back here, and I'm very feel blessed to be back here. So I'm happy that you came as well. And I'm just going to begin. The past decade or so, you can hear me, right? Okay. The past decade or so has witnessed the surprising rise of the genre of popular philosophy. And while there's much to applaud in this development, it conceals the risk that philosophy is understood as an expertise and the philosopher as some kind of expert, life coach for the literate who will tell one how to live. I won't name names, but it's kind of a movement of popular philosophy. And it's a good thing, but it's partially against this tendency that I want to turn to the subtle dialectic of thought and action that we find in tragedy. And by tragedy, I mean particularly ancient Greek tragedy, but I also have interests in Shakespeare and more generally. In my view, tragedy gives a richer sense of the complexity of human motivation and the sheer intractability of moral and political problems than can be found in the reassuring truisms of pop philosophy. Tragedy provides a better understanding of what it means to be human and sometimes inhuman. Gods abound in tragedy, and 1 or 2 dogs wander across the stage. And my project will seek to defend what I see as what is compelling and powerful in tragedy and tragic experience. In play after play of the 3 great tragedians, we have 31 plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Or Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. We find human beings somehow compelled to follow a path of suffering that allows them to raise questions which admit of no easy answer. What we find in tragedy after tragedy are people asking questions. The questions are, what will happen to me? What is the right path of action? The overwhelming experience of tragedy is a disorientation expressed in one bewildered and repeated question. The question is very simple. What shall I do? What shall I do? In the words of Aeschylus from the Oresteia, the only complete trilogy we have. And these were words that were recounted by Bobby Kennedy on the night of Martin Luther King's assassination. In Aeschylus' words, we must suffer into truth. Tragedy is the undergoing of a suffering that might permit an experience of truth that is neither contemplative or conceptual, let's say philosophical, nor is it empirical or scientific, but an experience of truth that emerges out of a visceral experience of the conflicts that are endemic to human action. These are conflicts that we encounter personally and politically on a day-to-day basis, especially during a time of crisis, when the certainties of the old world pass away and the uncertainties of a new world emerge obscurely into view. Tragedy is the art form of between times, between the old and the new. This is true of Greek tragedy, it's true of Elizabethan tragedy, and perhaps it's true of the tragedy of our times, out of joint as it doubtless is. Tragedy highlights what is perishable, what is fragile, and what is slow-moving about us. A very handy spot for my coat under there. What is fragile, what is slow-moving, what is perishable about us. In a world defined by relentless speed and the unending acceleration of information flows that cultivate amnesia and an endless thirst for the short-term future allegedly guaranteed through worship of the new prosthetic gods of technology, it's a long sentence, comma, tragedy is a way of applying an emergency brake. Tragedy is a kind of braking system. Tragedy slows things down by confronting us with what we do not know about ourselves, an unknown force that nonetheless unleashes violent effects on us on a daily, indeed often minute-by-minute basis. This is what psychoanalysts call a symptom whose source is unconscious. Such is the sometimes terrifying presence of the past that we can seek to disavow, but the past that will have its victory in the end, if only in the form of our mortality. In the words of Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia, fantastic film, we might be through with the past, but the past isn't through with us. That in many ways is the thought about tragedy. We might be through with the past, but the past isn't through with us. Through its sudden reversals of fortune, tragedy permits us to come face to face with what we do not know about ourselves, but which makes those selves the things they are. It's a very strange thought, which I'll try and make clear. Tragedy provokes what snags in our being, the snares and booby traps of the past that we blindly trip over in our relentless, stumbling forward movement. This is what the ancients called fate. And it requires our complicity in order to come down on us. And I'll come back to that thought. Fate is not, as it were, something outside of our control. Now, there are people that think that the fruit of a consideration of tragedy is a sense of life's hopelessness or moral resignation. This was the thought you can find in someone like Schopenhauer. I disagree with that. I think tragedy gives us a deepened ethical sense of the self in its radical dependence on others. It's a question of the self's vulnerable exposure to apparently familiar and familial patterns of kinship. One of the things that's at stake in play in tragedy after tragedy is the family and the nature of the family. And it turns out that sometimes that, as in the case of Oedipus, you don't know who your parents are. And if you do know who your parents are, you still don't know who they are. One of the most salient but enigmatic features of Greek tragedy is its constant negotiation with the other, especially the enemy other. Let me tell you a little story here. I mean, the oldest piece of theatre that we possess, the oldest play we have, is by Aeschylus. It's called The Persians from 472 BCE. BC, whatever you want to talk about that. It deals with the aftermath of the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. That was closer to the people watching that play, that battle, than 9/11 is to us. And there's a lot we can say about that play, but it's a play where we see the enemy, the defeated enemy, the Persians, lamenting in their court. And the first thing we learn, I think, from that play is not a sense of triumph over the enemy, but sympathy with the enemy. Sympathy with the enemy. The first rule of war, we could say, is sympathy with the enemy. And this is something that I think is developed by Euripides and in many of the tragedies that deal with the Trojan War. I could say a lot more about this. The Trojan War in tragedy is not about how great the Greeks were in destroying the Trojans, but in a sense how lousy the Greeks were in destroying the Trojans. So the tragedies are not celebrations of what it means to be Greek, but warning signs that if you are triumphant, if you are, if you don't learn the lessons of war, you're obliged to repeat them. Aristotle put it perspicuously some millennia ago: tragedy is the imitation of action. That's Aristotle's thought. Mimesis, praxios. But what is meant by action? It's far from clear. What we see in tragedy are characters utterly disorientated by the situation in which they find themselves. They do not know how to act. And we hear this repeated refrain already mentioned in tragedy after tragedy. What shall I do? What shall I do? So tragedy is thinking in action, upon action, for the sake of action, but this thinking takes the form of questioning. What is in question in tragedy is action. How do I act? What shall I do? What the experience of tragedy invites is neither the blind impulsiveness of action, nor some retreat into a solitary life of contemplation, which is the promise offered by certain versions of philosophy, Aristotle, but the difficulty of action. This is the point. It's about action, but the difficulty of action in a world defined by ambiguity, where right always seems to be on both sides. Here is the power and enigma of tragedy. Right, justice, law seems to be divided between equal, opposed, and mutually justified claims. It's not that in a tragedy there's a hero that's right and a baddie that's wrong. In a tragedy, both sides are justified, and we have a conflict between them. Right? Now, part of the joy of wandering into the ancient world and dealing with these seemingly remote phenomena like ancient Greek tragedy is how little we know and how little we will ever know. And of the many things that we don't know, and part of what I like about this work is there's so little that we know, is what the spectator was meant to take away from the tragedy. The ancient Greek word for spectator was theoros, from which we get the word theoria, theory, which is linked to the verb to see, theorein, which takes place in a theatre, a theatron. If I had a board, I could write all this down. So a spectator is a theorist in Greek. Right? Theory begins in a theatre. And what the theorist observes is praxis, practice, action, from a theoretical perspective. The question of theory and practice that we talk about, that we think about, what's true in theory might not be true in practice or whatever, opens in theatre and as theatre. That's what theatre is. It's about the relationship between theory and practice. Theory is a theatre where we're spectators on a drama that unfolds, our drama. In theatre, human action, human praxis is called into question theoretically. Now, aside from a fragment from the great sophist Gorgias that we might look at if I've got time, and a play by Aristophanes called The Frogs, where he stages a debate between Euripides and Aeschylus as to who is the top tragedian. The spectator reports that we have of Greek tragedy come from two other sources, Plato and Aristotle. Now, in the case of Plato, basing your views of Greek tragedy on the views of Plato are a little like basing your view of the Vikings on the reports of the Christian monks whose monasteries they ransacked. It's hardly an impartial view. And despite some wonderful historical, philological and archaeological work, and archaeology is often undermined, but it turns up some extraordinary findings, we really have no idea how theatre tragedy was seen. We don't even know who attended the plays. We don't know, for example, with any certainty whether women attended the tragedies. There are some people that think they did, but there's no evidence that would clinch it one way or the other. And that presents an extraordinary conundrum, because classical Athens was a deeply patriarchal society with very clear roles assigned to men and women. And what happens in theatre appears to be the inversion of those roles in these unruly women who are sometimes virgins and sometimes wives. Antigone, who's a virgin, Medea, who's a mother, Phaedra, Andromache, Hecuba, Cassandra. What's going on in this? We don't know really what's going on, but it's fascinating. So, far from being a kind of... The fact that we don't know anything, I think, is a virtue. And if there's something I want to point towards, is that what underpins tragedy is a certain form of skepticism. Skepticism is the index for a certain ethical orientation in the world, an orientation that seems to emerge from the disorientation of not knowing what to do. Now, as Friedrich Nietzsche's nemesis, Williamowitz, said, it's a great thought, to make the ancients speak, we must feed them with our own blood. To make the ancients speak, we must feed them with our own blood. We don't know, right? So it's our blood that's required. Of course, the irony here is that Nietzsche says exactly the same thing. It's our blood that makes the ancients speak to us. Now, without wanting to piggyback on the recent dizzying success of vampire fiction, the latter's portion of the truth is that the ancients need our true blood in order to speak to us. When revived, we will notice that when the ancients speak, they do not merely tell us about themselves, they tell us about us. But who is that us that might still be claimed and compelled by these ancient texts? And here is the beauty and the strangeness of the thought. This us is not necessarily existent. This us is rather invitational. Invitational. My concern in thinking about tragedy is to extend that invitation to you to become part of a we, an us, that's called and called into question by Greek tragedy. More simply stated, every generation has to reinvent the classics. Has to reinvent the classics with their own blood. And I think this is the responsibility of every generation, to engage in this reinvention. If we don't, then we become even more stupid. And the nice thing is that stupidity is very easily avoided. It's really, really simple to not be stupid. One reads. One reads. And one reads, for example, these plays. There are 31 of them, and they're not that long. It would take you 10 days to read the entire corpus, if you didn't sleep that much. And although this might sound pompous, I see this as the responsibility of each generation, to pass on something of the deep and unknown past in a way that will speak to the present and arrest us momentarily from the irresistible pull of the future. If the disavowal of the past through the endless production of the new is the very formula for ideology, that would be my sense of the ideology that we live in, let's say broadly conceived, is one of a compulsive sense of the new, of a short-term, medium-term future. Tragedy slows us down, it pulls us back, it reveals something that snags, that pulls us back towards a past we don't want to acknowledge. To that extent, tragedy provides the resources for a critique of that ideology that might at least allow for the imagination of a different range of human possibilities. But first we need to apply an emergency brake. Stop. Right? The lectures from which this lecture is drawn, which I'm giving at the New School for Social Research this semester, they're going to be online, or they are online, or whatever, are called Tragedies Philosophy. And the thought here is a very simple thought. It's that philosophy, what is philosophy? Philosophy is a discursive invention, it's an invention in language, that arguably begins with Plato, and it's premised upon the exclusion of tragedy and the exclusion of a range of experiences that we can call tragic. And I want to suggest that this exclusion of tragedy is itself tragic, and this is arguably philosophy's tragedy. So philosophy's tragedy is its exclusion of the tragic poets, and perhaps of poets as such. I want to defend tragedy against philosophy, or perhaps better said, that tragedy articulates a philosophical view that challenges the authority of philosophy by giving voice to something contradictory about us, something constricted, something precarious, something limited about us. In other words, tragedy gives voice to what suffers in us and in others, and how we might become cognizant of that suffering and work with that suffering, where suffering is something we undergo, a passion, a pathos that we undergo, and is something that is partially overtaken in action. I emphasize partially. In reading tragedy, we might learn to appreciate both the precariousness of existence and what Judith Butler would call its grievability. Its grievability. I'll come back and make that more clear. But the first iteration of these lectures was given as a course with Judith a few years back. At the source of tragedy is grief and the extreme passions of mourning and lamentation. So what goes on in tragedy, for example, this first play, Persians, is people lamenting because people have been killed. There are, for example, 13 nouns in Attic Greek for words describing grief, lamentation, and mourning, and elaborate rituals concerned with how one should mourn, what one should do. It's precisely this grief and lamentation that Socrates wants to exclude from the education and the life of the philosopher, and most importantly, from the philosophically well-ordered city. There is a book called Republic by Plato. Republic is a translation of the Greek politeia, which we can think of, I like to translate as regime. Politeia as regime. Philosophy is the imagining of a regime, the imagining of a form of political organization based upon the intense regulation of affect, in particular the affect of grief. Now, to explain that thought to you and make it persuasive, I would have to take you through books 2, 3, and 10 of the Republic, and we have to look at that. But trust me, it's there, and it's really compelling. The twisted ferocity of Plato's denunciation of tragedy seems to conceal a deeper worry about the nature of the philosophical perspective that tragedy seems to embody, and its relation to what is all too simplistically called sophistry. The larger project this is part of, I gave a lecture on this on Tuesday in the New School, is about sophistry, where the standard story is that sophistry is bad and philosophy is good. It's more complicated than that, but it's a simple way of putting it. And I'm trying to defend the sophists, particularly Gorgias, and to try and show the links between forms of sophistical reasoning and tragic reasoning against philosophy. And my general question could be stated the following way. What if we took seriously the form of thinking that we find in tragedy and the experience of partial agency, limited autonomy, deep traumatic affect, conflict, political complexity, and moral ambiguity that it presents. How might that change the way we think about thinking? So, at the core of tragedy, on my view, is an experience of moral ambiguity, profound moral ambiguity. And if we began thinking through that, how might that change the way we think? And in terms of a precursor for this line of thought, one precursor would be Nietzsche. Nietzsche described himself as the first tragic philosopher. And I'm not altogether in agreement with Nietzsche, to say the least, but I want to join Nietzsche in that defense of a tragic philosophy. Now I've talked in a rather abstract way. Let me give you an example and try and focus in more closely on a story. The most famous of the Athenian tragedies, the one which has been since the time of Aristotle's Poetics held up as the highest exemplar of tragedy, is Oedipus the king. Oedipus Rex. In Greek it's Oedipus Tyrannos, Oedipus the tyrant. Remember that, Oedipus the tyrant. In this infernal machine of the play, in this unstoppable machine of a play, the king is exposed as a tyrant and deposed as a monster and a pollution by the very city that made him king in the first place. So we're used to thinking about tragedy in terms of a tragic hero who is complicated. But in many ways, in ancient Greek tragedy, the hero is not the solution to the problem, but the problem. The hero is the problem. We usually think of tragedy as a misfortune. Right? Let's go back to the beginning. We usually think of tragedy as a misfortune. It's something that befalls a person, an accident, a fatal disease. It's tragic. Or a natural disaster is tragic, like a tsunami, or a terrorist attack is tragic. Namely, we use the word tragic to describe something that's outside of our control. But if tragedy is understood as a misfortune that's outside of our control, then we misunderstand tragedy. What the 31 extant Greek tragedies show in play after play is that tragedy is not a misfortune that is outside of our control. Rather, they show the way in which we collude, seemingly unknowingly, with the calamity that befalls us. So tragedy requires some form of complicity on our part in the disaster that destroys us. It's not simply a question of a dark, malevolent fate, prophecy that flows from the will of the gods. Tragedy requires our collusion with that fate. In other words, fate requires no small measure of freedom. Let me try and explain. It's in this way we can understand the tragedy of Oedipus. There's a merciless irony in Sophocles' Oedipus the king, which extends to his name. Oedipus, swollen foot. But in Attic Greek, the word oida is I know. I know. So Oedipus, bad foot, is the person who knows. He knows nothing, or almost nothing. We watch someone move from a position of seeming knowledge to a deeper truth that it would appear that Oedipus knew nothing about. So here we go. So we begin with Oedipus coming out on stage in front of the people who've come to see him, because there is a plague in the city and people are dying of thirst, children are dying. And he comes out and says, I'm Oedipus. You know who I am. Some call me great. I solve riddles. What seems to be the problem? He knows who he is at the beginning of the play. It turns out he doesn't know who he is. Now, The deeper truth about Oedipus is that he is a parricide and a perpetrator of incest. But things are more complex than that, because there's a backstory that needs to be recalled. This is fascinating for me. Oedipus turned up in Thebes and solved the Sphinx's riddle after refusing to return to what he believed was his native Corinth, because he had been told the prophecy about himself by the oracle, namely that he would kill his father and have sex with his mother. Oedipus knew his curse, and it's on the way from the oracle that's told him the truth about who he is that he meets an older man at a crossroads who looks a lot like him. There's an amazing moment later in the play where Jocasta, who he believes is his wife, and Oedipus are toying. Oedipus is beginning, the wheels are beginning to turn in his head. He said, well, what did this older man look like? And she said, he looked a lot like you. Does she know? What does she know? He meets an older man at a crossroads and refuses to give way, and then kills him in a fine example of ancient road rage. Right? And it's something, because he's got guards, he's got a chariot, he's to kill the guards and then kill the old guy. Oedipus does it. Now, one might have thought that given the awful news from the oracle, you're going to kill your father, have sex with your mother, and given his uncertainty about the identity of his father, Oedipus is called a bastard by a drunk at a banquet in Corinth, and this is what infects his mind with doubt. He cannot get rid of the thought, maybe I'm a bastard, he's thinking. That's why he goes to the oracle. One might have thought that he would have exercised caution before deciding to kill an older man that actually resembled him. One moral of tragedy, then, is that we conspire with our fate. We conspire with our fate. That is, fate requires our freedom in order to bring down our destiny upon us. And this is the most difficult thought that we confront in tragedy, I think, the most compelling and strangest thought, namely that we both know and we don't know at the same time. We both know and we don't know at the same time, and we're destroyed in the process. In the wider project from which I'm drawing from here, I keep coming back to this difficult and intolerable thought. How can you know and not know? It wasn't that Oedipus didn't know, he knew, he'd just been told. And yet he's still, the hand is raised in rage and he acts. What is going on at that point? And might that have some connection to who we are in our rage, in our anger, when the hand is raised and you hit out? What do you know at that point? Do you know? At some level you know. At another level, something is acting through you. Right? Such is the complex function of prophecy in tragedy. In the tragedy of Oedipus, we watch someone who believes they possess an unencumbered sense of freedom become undone and destroyed by the force of fate. Oedipus believes he's free, he's happy. Some call me Oedipus, I'm great. Oedipus is like Kanye West at the beginning of the play. He's like that moment of I am a god, I am this, you know who I am. I speak of myself in the third person. Kanye would do this, or Oedipus would do this. He's like that. And it's that breaks down. It's that's destroyed in the drama, right? In the name of a truth which causes him to pick out his eyes. What's so delicate in Oedipus' experience is that his being is not simply causally determined by fate, by necessity. No, fate requires Oedipus' partially conscious complicity in order to bring about its truth. Characters in tragedy are not robots or somehow pre-programmed. In its movement from a delusional self-knowledge and the fantasy of an unencumbered freedom to an experience of an insight into truth that costs us our eyes, tragedy gives voice to an experience of agency that is partial and very often painful. Tragedy shows the limits of our attempted self-sufficiency, the limits of what we think of as our autonomy, our freedom. I am who I am, you know. Tragedy gives voice to the complex relation between freedom and necessity that defines our being. Our freedom is constantly compromised by that which catches us in the nets of the past, in the determination of our past by fate. Tragedy enacts that which snags at our being and pulls us back to a past that we disavow in our constant thirst for the short-term future. Such is the weight of the past that entangles the tragic protagonist in its meshes. As Rita Felsky says, the weight of what has gone bears down ineluctably on what is yet to come. To disavow the past is to be destroyed by it. Right? That's tragedy's lesson. To disavow the past is to be destroyed by it. If you say, I have no history, you know, I am the son of chance, as Oedipus says in the play. It's just chance, you know, and there are all these books that have appeared in the last 20 on chance, right? It's just luck. You will be destroyed, would be the lesson of Oedipus. In tragedy, time is out of joint, and the linear conception of time as a teleological flow from the past to the future is thrown into reverse. Nothing that happens in tragedy is that time, which appears to go past, present, future, doesn't go past, present, future. The past is not past, the future folds back on itself, and the present is shot through with fluxions of past and future that destabilize it. Time flexes and twists in tragedy. Its script is you and me, as David Bowie said. Tragedy has a kind of boomerang structure. This is a good way of thinking, a boomerang structure, where the action that we throw out into the world returns to us with a potentially fatal velocity. And we knew nothing. Us? What did we do? Oedipus, the solver of riddles, becomes the riddle himself. Sophocles' play shows him engaged in a relentless inquiry into the pollution that is destroying the political order, poisoning the wells and producing infant mortality, but it turns out he is that pollution. He is the sickness. And the deeper truth is that Oedipus knows something about this from the get-go. He knows this, but he refuses to see and hear what is said to him. Very early in Oedipus the King, the blind Tiresias, this extraordinary character Tiresias, the prophet, tells him to his face that he is the perpetrator of the pollution that he seeks to eradicate. Tiresias says, you're not going to like this. He says, Tiresias is dragged in. He says, so what do you say, Tiresias? You're not going to like this at all. So he tries, I don't want to say this. I'm tired. I want to go home. Let me go. No. What is it? He says, well, you are the pollution. You are the perpetrator that you're trying to seek. Oedipus just doesn't hear it. It's going completely over him. So partially what tragedy is about are the conditions of seeing and hearing. Right? You can be told something and you hear nothing. You can see something and you see nothing. And we do that all the time, particularly in our familial relations. Me with my mother, I won't go into that, but And you get in a rage. Right? You become enraged and, whatever. Oedipus doesn't hear Tiresias. And this is one way of interpreting the word tyrant in this play. Oedipus tyrannos. The tyrant doesn't hear what is said to him and doesn't see what is in front of his eyes. And we are tyrants too. We look, but we see nothing. Someone speaks to us, but we hear nothing. And we go on in our endlessly narcissistic self-justification. Maybe changing our Facebook profile a little. Tragedy is about many things, but it's centrally concerned with the conditions for actually seeing and actually hearing. In making us blind, we might finally achieve insight, unblock our ears, and stop the endless droning of that song of ourselves. Me, me, me. Right? This is all for me. Right? It turns out that that's not the case. There's a wonderful Greek expression, shame lies on the eyelids. Shame lies on the eyelids. It's a way of thinking about Oedipus. Oedipus, with his eyes open, experiences no shame. He's the tyrant. When his eyes fall, when he takes his eyes out, he experiences shame. So the tyrant experiences no shame. Hosni Mubarak had no shame. Gaddafi had no shame. Berlusconi had and has no shame. President Assad has no shame. Yanukovych in Ukraine has no shame. Rupert Murdoch has no shame. Donald Trump seems rather short on shame. These are tyrants, right? And whatever you say to the tyrant, they will hear or not hear, right? In accordance to whether it matches with their sense of who they are. But we also have no shame. We are little tyrants, especially when it comes to our relations to those we think of as our parents and our children. And I think of as one example from the great soup of popular culture from which I like to eat. Think of the character of Walter White from Breaking Bad, who insisted again and again until almost the end of that show that he did everything for his family. I did all of this for you. Until the last show when his wife finally says to him, but you enjoyed it, right? That's tyranny. That's tyranny. His wife finally gets him to admit that he'd become the meth king of New Mexico, the Heisenberg of the southwestern USA, because he enjoyed it. That's a start. At least he's acknowledging his desire. So Walter White would be a good example of an Oedipus before the tragedy, right? Or in a sense, what I think why that show is so compelling is we see someone drawn into the kind of psychosis of tyranny. Where this goes. It's a world without shame. It's what psychoanalysts call perversion. And the pervert is someone who doesn't experience prohibition or the law because law is something that they make and others correspond to. Right? And let's hope there are no perverts. You're all good neurotics. It's fine. You're fine. Neurotics, we're all neurotics. That's great. It's all my fault. That's fine. When that begins to break down, then you're in real trouble. And you see Walter White go from being a sort of neurotic to a pervert, and we're fascinated by that. It's really compelling, but it's dangerous. Greek tragedy provides lessons in shame. When we learn that lesson and finally achieve some insight, as Oedipus does, then it might cost us our sight and we might pluck out our eyes for shame. The political world is stuffed, overfull with sham shame, with ham humility, and carefully staged, tearful apologies. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Chris Christie, 3 hours of it. I knew nothing. I didn't know. How could I have known? And you think of Oedipus, right? Think of Oedipus. You knew something. Right? And this has a huge effect in terms of how we think about, who we are and what happens to us. I won't go into this now, but I wrote something a few years ago about 9/11 in this regard, and it's I can say more about that in discussion. But tragedy is a boomerang structure. We throw things out into the world, and then when the boomerang comes back and hits us in the face, and we go, I didn't throw that out. It's got no relationship to me. We're surprised, and that's where we need tragedy to kind of wake us up. Okay, Anne Carson, the great poet and classicist, in her extraordinary translations of Euripides, please read them, they're called grief lessons. In many ways, tragedy is grief lessons for her, that's right. She says the following: why does tragedy exist? Because you are full of rage. Why are you full of rage? Because you are full of grief, she says. So tragedy is about rage that flows from grief. And I want to add a third question to that. Why are you full of grief? To which we might answer that we're full of grief because we're full of war and people are being killed. Tragedy might be defined as rage that follows from the grief that flows in war. Rage, grief, war. The history of Greek tragedy is the history of war. From the war with the Persians in the early 5th century to the Peloponnesian Wars that run until that century's end. From the emergence of Athens as an imperial power to Athens' dissolution and humiliation at the hands of Sparta. As I already said, the oldest play we have, Persians from 472, deals with the aftermath of the Battle of Salamis from 480. But more than half the tragedies that we have were composed after the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War in 431. 431 is when the democracy of Athens goes to war with Sparta. Oedipus the King was first performed in 429, 2 years after the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, during a time of plague that was estimated to have killed 1/4 of the Athenian population. So the plague in Sophocles, this is the problem we have because we're historically blind. The plague in Sophocles is not some abstraction, it's very real indeed. The plague was you can find descriptions of the plague in Thucydides, it's fascinating. But the frame of tragedy is war and war's devastating effects on human life. Now, Greek tragedy is largely about combat veterans, and it was largely performed by combat veterans. Most of the actors would have been people that served in the Athenian version of the military. And it was played before an audience that either participated directly in war or who were indirectly implicated in war. All were traumatized by it, and everyone felt its effects. War was the life of the city, and also its pride, as Pericles argues. But it was also war, its fall, and its undoing. Yet Attic tragedy, and this is what's so, I think, powerful about Greek tragedy, is a war story without a John Wayne figure. Right? Without heroes, or where the figure of the hero has become deeply problematic. This is the great virtue, the realism of ancient tragedy, as opposed to the idealized violence and empty empathy of most contemporary war fictions. Right? I mean, it would be wonderful if war films actually were war films, right? Made by people involved in war with some knowledge of war, but we content ourselves with something else, with a kind of pornography. Right? We live in a world whose frame is war, and where justice seems to be endlessly divided between claim and counterclaim, right and left, conservative and progressive, believer and non-believer, or whatever. Each side believes unswervingly in the rightness of its position and the wrongness, or as is usually said, the evil of the enemy. Such a belief legitimates violence, a destructive violence that unleashes counter-violence, and we seem to be trapped in a cycle of bloody revenge. If such is what often seems to pass for international politics in our world, then some reflection on tragedy might at the very least illuminate our current predicament. Given that the frame for our experience of the present is also that of war, and the politics of grief that it both mobilizes and seeks to regulate or even repress, tragedy's philosophy might tell us something about our present. Just give you an illustration of that. I mean, how long have I could go on for days like this, but I don't want to. 15 minutes. Okay, I'll do 10, 12. But the other, this is kind of how it is, right? I mean, we're used to an idea, movies, popular culture, where there are good guys and bad guys. In tragedy, we don't have such simplicity. And that's because the people involved in these things, I think, actually experience some of the complexity of life close up. Okay, so let's take the one extant trilogy we have, the Oresteia. Helen disappears off to Troy with Paris because there are 6 possible reasons which could be given at that point. She likes the guy. Off she goes. The Trojan War begins. Agamemnon is gathering, King of Argos is gathering ships to sail to attack Troy. There's an oracle which says that in order to get favorable wind to cross the Aegean Sea to Troy, a sacrifice has to be made, namely the sacrifice of his daughter. He's got a couple. He chooses Iphigenia. Iphigenia is sacrificed at the port of Chalkis. Right? Okay. And off he goes to war. 10 years pass. The Greeks win. Clytemnestra has been waiting. His wife, Clytemnestra, has been waiting those 10 years. She set up a beacon system of fire beacons from Troy all the way to Argos that will give her early warning as to when the war is going to end. She gets the signal and she knows what to do. Agamemnon turns up with his concubine Cassandra in tow. If you get to win a war, the deal normally was that the men are killed and the women and children are enslaved, either become concubines or housekeepers. And Clytemnestra murders him, right? Because he sacrificed her daughter. Orestes, the son of Agamemnon, is slightly upset that his father's been murdered. That's not right. Wives don't murder husbands. So the next play, the first play is called the Agamemnon, where Agamemnon gets killed. The next play, the Koiphori, the libation bearers, is where Orestes kills his mother. And there's a moment of hesitation in the play when Orestes turns to his friend Pylades and says to Pylades, "This is really hard. It's hard to kill your mother." And he says, "It's okay, Apollo ordained it." Okay then. She dies. So we have 2 versions of justice. two versions of justice and two divine orders in conflict. Supporting Orestes' case, we have the god Apollo, and supporting the case of Clytemnestra, we have the Furies, the ancient old goddesses. And the third play, the Humanities, brings those two forces together in Athens, in the heart of the city where this play was going to be produced, and we end up in a law court with a legal tribunal. Again, what's fascinating about Greek tragedy is its relationship to law and legal proceedings. The goddess Athena, it's her town, Athens, after all, presides at the law court, which is on the high mountain, the Areopagus in Athens, still there, where St. Paul preached with almost no success, because the Athenians were far too skeptical. And she tries to judge between the case. And she decides in favour of Orestes, although there's a jury and the whole thing. The point of the story is that we're in a situation of justified violence, where violence is justified with reference to appeals to the way things should be done. Fathers shouldn't sacrifice daughters to go on some military adventure, and wives shouldn't murder husbands. And what tragedy shows is how the right, justice, what the Greeks call dike, is divided, is a kind of conflictual structure. And the question that's raised is, can the cycle of violence and counter-violence be arrested, be suspended? Right? And that sounds like an abstract set of concerns, unless you think about the world. Right? And if you think about what's going on in the Ukraine right now, or what's going on in Syria right now, we have a situation where justice is divided, right? We have a conflict. And we'd like to think that it's a very simple conflict between right and wrong, but it's not. Is there a way of suspending the cycle of violence? That in many ways is tragedy's question. And tragedy doesn't offer a kind of hopeless, optimistic answer to that. It offers a very realistic way of thinking that through. Or again, think about this in relationship. The situation that I grew up with in Britain was the situation in Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, people that both called themselves Christians, who happened to be one side Protestant, the other side Catholic, both engaged in acts of violence which were justified on both sides. And cycles would be repeated, revenge killing went on and on and on. And these people hated each other for that reason, and they had very long memories. Right? Somehow a way was found to suspend momentarily the cycle of violence. And now we have a situation where in the Northern Ireland Assembly, which was suspended for 40 odd years, people who were military enemies at least sit down in the same chamber. They're not friends, they're never going to be friends, but they're not killing each other. Right? And something like law is in operation. That's kind of a good outcome. I'll finish with two remarks. The first remark comes directly out of what I've just said, which is that, let me just put it this way, and then I can send you this text if you want to read it at your leisure. There's lots of stuff that I haven't been able to go into. In tragedy, justice is conflict. In tragedy, justice is conflict. It's a fight between opposed parties who are prepared to act violently in justice's name. And we might say that what we see in tragedy is an experience of adversary reasoning or adversarial reasoning, where we think from the adversary's position and use reason in order to hear the other side. And this is what goes on in the Humanities. If one were optimistically inclined, one might see tragedy as providing an object lesson in resolving conflicts reasonably in a world of overwhelming enmity. I'm not sure whether I'm so optimistic, because what we see in tragedy is the weakness of rational argumentation in the presence of violence and the persistence of forms of arbitrary decision-making. But nonetheless, it's there. Right? So what tragedy shows us is both the ways in which violence can be arrested, and it also shows us that when often the best arguments are presented, nothing happens. Right? And this, I think, is something we can find in Thucydides, the great historian Thucydides, that all that we have in education, in universities, is speech and the power of speech. And speech is a powerful thing. But does speech, can speech ultimately stop violence? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. We have to acknowledge that. The experience of justice as conflict in tragedy also could be said to lead us to the following view. In Greek tragedy, we enter a polytheistic world, with a diversity of conflicting gods and rival conceptions of the good. There's a philosopher called Stuart Hampshire, who's not as read as he should be, but a very interesting figure, Stuart Hampshire, who suggests that it is prudent to abandon any notion of monotheism, whether any of the three monotheisms, a Platonic monotheism that circles around the good, or indeed the secular monotheism of liberal democracy and human rights that still circles around a weak, deistic conception of God. And this raises the question as to whether the teaching on the plurality of gods in Joseph Smith's late work or in the King Follett's sermon might be at least thinkable in relationship to such a claim, but I'll leave that for discussion and for the rest of it. But the idea is that what we have in tragedy is not, as it were, one idea of God, but a God who is many, or a God that is divided. And that's an interesting thought. The last point I want to make is this. Is tragedy something that's available to us in the contemporary world? It is. But there's a school of thought that you can find in figures like George Steiner that tragedy is dead. Right? I want to argue against that with a figure like Raymond Williams in his brilliant book, Modern Tragedy, that tragedy provides a powerful template for diagnosing the seemingly intractable conflicts that define the present and finding ethical resources for thinking beyond them. It's in this spirit, I think, that we could and should approach the struggles of our time. A tragic sensibility obliges us to see our implication within the struggles of the present and our responsibility for them. I mean, an example of that, if you think about situations tragically rather than statically, it can be helpful. So, for example, if we think about, the Arab Spring or the Egyptian Revolution, the usual way we think about that is that there was an oppressive regime of Hosni Mubarak, and the people rose up and threw off that regime, and there will be liberation, democracy, human rights for all. Didn't exactly work out that way, right? And if you have a deeper dialectical understanding of history, I think you're more, which you can get from tragedy, and I think you're better armed to think through the complexity of such situations. Namely, that when a regime like that is thrown off, often what you'll find will be a dialectical counter-effect. The appearance of liberation will be inverted. Nothing really changed in the state of Egypt, and the military seized power once again last summer, and we find ourselves in a situation which resembles the situation before the whole thing started. So tragedy is a way of, I think, gives us a realistic vocabulary for thinking through complex situations. Last paragraph. The question of tragedy should not be confined to its existence or non-existence as a dramatic genre, which might or might not exist in theatre. Rather, it's a mode of experience that can be found well outside theatre, in film, in TV, and in political life itself, and I think in life as such. Furthermore, tragedy is a dialectical mode. Specifically, it's a mode of reversal, inversion, and negation, where we find ourselves implicated at each step, albeit unconsciously. Tragedy is an object lesson in dialectical thinking. It's a staging of dialectics, which is why Hegel had such a profound grasp of tragedy, even if he occasionally misunderstood it. And what's new in my thinking, I think, in this project is an attempt to focus on tragedy's philosophy, is to think through this dialectical turn, which is properly pessimistic, but it is, I think, a hopeful, affirmative pessimism as opposed to a hopeless, upbeat idealism. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Could you take the questions? I sometimes don't see people, so
I was very interested in what you were saying about technology at the beginning
Yeah.
of your talk, and my question is technology really a prosthetic godhood, or is it a tragic wound? And what might tragedy say about our quickly approaching post-human future or futures?
Wow, that's a lot. What would be the post-human part? What do you mean by that? And
I'm talking mostly about just, well, we have Freud talking about the prosthetic godhood with the eye.
And that's where I'm taking it from, yeah,
So
yeah.
we have all of these prosthetics, potential changes
Mm-hmm.
in the way our bodies are conceived, our identity
Yeah,
is conceived,
yeah.
and how might that, what if tragedy arrests?
Yes.
What are we going to do? What is tragedy going to say about that post-human future?
We shouldn't believe it. Really, we shouldn't believe it. We should. We need to think more slowly and more carefully with a richer historical archive. I think the only to go back, the question of what do the humanities do? What are the humanities about? For me, it's not. The humanities are an archive, a series of possibilities embedded in the past, which, when approached or understood, or can unleash extraordinary effects in how we think about the present and the future. So that's what I mean about tragedy as a kind of brake system. There's a view which is common amongst all sorts of people, that there are forms of dramatic historical change between periods, and you can give them names: post-modernity, liquid modernity, whatever it is, and you think a thing up. Risk society. You write a book about it and you say, look, it's all different now, and I've written a book about it. That's how it is. This stuff is going to say no. Actually, what we find in the human experience is something oddly consistent, oddly constant. The miracle that this whole stupid project is premised upon is the fact that something like Sophocles is still legible to us. Not just legible in the way in which the Epic of Gilgamesh is legible, but legible in the sense in which it can still affect us in a visceral way. It speaks to something about us. It's 2,500 years. we have to feed that with our own blood and all the rest of it, but it speaks to something where we realize that whatever the human adventure is, the changes are often overemphasized. And if we don't operate a brake system and we don't, as it were, listen to what slows down, then we operate without a memory, doomed to repeat ever more short-term versions of the future. And technology as an ideology fits into that. Now, things change, sure, things change, but not quite in the ways that we perhaps are told that they change.
Yeah, please.
Here. So I hear echoes of Levinas in your work.
Yeah.
I mean, like the braking system is something that I think seems at least quasi-Levinas.
Yes.
However, it seems from how I understand your analysis of tragedy that it only makes us aware of what Levinas has called the narcissism of the sane.
Yes.
But it doesn't seem to, at least to me, that from what I'm understanding, that tragedy calls us or awakens us from that narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
Is the call supposed to come from the spectator, as the theoretician, or does the call come from elsewhere?
That's a very good question. I mean, Levinas is one of the figures who's, informs this because I'm still very attached to Levinas's thinking. But I think that I also want to approach Levinas as a drama. I've written a book, which it might be a book, it might not be a book, it's not clear, but it came out in a kind of frenzy last year, and I'm sort of just looking at it. And it begins with an idea of Levinas as a dramatist, and thinking about philosophy not as in terms of metaphysical structures or ontological structures or whatever, but in terms of dramatic conflict. Levinas is very bad at arguments, often, but you know what he's talking about. But if you understand Levinas as a kind of dramatic response to a situation, I think it's powerful. And obviously the strong echo in relation to what I was saying is around the question of war. Levinas's work is completely infused with the experience of war and how one responds to that philosophically. I think that's also what I'm seeing in tragedy. But part of what's going on in this project is a questioning of philosophy and a questioning of so I could say, well, in a world of war, governed by totality, we need to remember the ethical relation of infinite responsibility to the other person, and that's first philosophy, metaphysics. I'm not going to make that move. I'm going to say that's there, that what we see in tragedy opens is an idea of a self that's dependent, that's vulnerable, that's opened by grief, but we have to also recognize the limitations of what we can do in our thinking about. This is kind of the underside of this project, which is, this is an experiment, I'm not sure where this is going to go, but there's a view of tragedy which is very widespread and which is just wrong, which is tragedy as a kind of religious ritual, right? It might come out of religious ritual, it makes references to ritual and all of that, but tragedy is about reason. It's about argument, back and forth. And we see people deploying arguments in the most powerful way they're capable of. So let me give you an example. In The Trojan Women by Euripides, Helen, who is the cause of all the misery that's led to the Trojan War, she's there. The Trojan women are assembled on the plain. The men have all been killed. Various of the children are being killed during the play. It's a very grim play. The city is smouldering. The women are awaiting their fate. knowing that fate is either going to be household slavery or sexual slavery. Hecuba, Helen turns up, and Menelaus, her husband, shows up, and they try and Hecuba says, kill her. Kill her. I mean, she started this. For God's sake, just kill her. And Menelaus says, yeah. I didn't come to talk, I came to kill. And then Helen says, no, you can't, no, whoa. We're Greeks, and I'm entitled to my defense, my moment in court. I'm entitled to explain my situation. And she begins to defend herself with exquisite rationality. And then every point that she makes is flattened by Hecuba. Boom, 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 boom. And she's obviously guilty. And then what does Menelaus do? He says, well, okay, she can come on ship. I won't kill her now. I'll take her with me and we'll decide what's going to happen. And Hecuba pleads with him, don't take her. He says, once a lover, always a lover. Once a lover, always a lover. Once you see her, you won't be able to resist her. Because Helen is hot, right? Helen is, she's hot. And the point being is that here we have the use of argument, which philosophers believe will have the power to cause a certain line of action. The force of the better argument, as like Habermas would have said. And yet it fails. So what we see in tragedy is both the necessity for argumentation and rationality and its weakness in the face of a violent situation. I think that's kind of where I'm heading.
Matt, yeah.
I have a couple points that I'd like you to
Aye.
Good. I'm struck with the similarity from your formulation of tragedy and Bernard and Vidal in that case.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I owe a huge amount to them.
Kind, right, as a kind of Danos or monster.
Yes.
When Oedipus solves the riddle of the Sphinx, what he sees, of course, he's answering the riddle, what walks on 4 legs, 2 legs, and 3 legs, and it's quadrupus, dipus, and tripus, right? So then it's Oedipus is really the answer to the riddle. He doesn't get that, so he doesn't know that he's the monster, like Luke Skywalker tearing out the mask and saying,
Exactly.
himself.
Exactly.
There. And so there's this fundamental.
I hadn't thought of that. It's very good.
Well, it's always Star Wars for me. But he's fundamentally conflicted. It's not just the God, the pantheon is fundamentally conflicted. The universe is fundamentally in conflict, right?
Yep.
The idea of the dissoi logo, the double speech, it's
Yep.
a dialectical form.
Yep.
And I also like the way that you talk about.
What he says is, I owe a huge amount of this to Vernon and Vidal-Naquet, Myth and Tragedy in Ancient Greece, and absolutely.
So I want to know if you depart from their reading in the way they describe hamartia, right, which is, for centuries has been mistranslated as tragic flaw, but of course it's not. It's action. It's a sin or a crime. And the way they describe it is that the tragic hero is caught up in a kind of sinister force that he himself has released.
Yeah.
It's both internal to him and external to him. You're talking about in terms of freedom.
Yeah.
Do you differ from their?
Not really. I think I'm very close to that.
It's both. It's paradoxical, right? But that's the tragic formulation. Is that yes, it's an act of will of some sort, but it's also we had no other choice.
Yeah. I think I'm very close to them on that. My only real disagreement with Vernon and Vidal-Naquet is on this point that there's a book by Bernard Williams called Shame and Necessity, which is a very important book for me, by a philosopher that, well, I won't go into that. It could have been, it's his best book. And he, for Vernon, there's an experience of partial agency in Greek tragedy, which has still not acquired autonomy, So it's as if, Vernon and Vidal-Naquet, the Greeks are on their way to autonomy, on their way to self-sufficiency, on their way to modernity. He pushes it a little far, but I like that point. What Williams is trying to do is to show that the world of Greek tragedy is actually very similar. The situation of the world of Greek tragedy is very similar to the situation in which we find ourselves. And what is alien in that world is basically the entire history of philosophy that comes in between. That both, he'll say this thing that Plato, Aristotle, Kant and Hegel, despite their differences, all shared the idea that rationality could render intelligible that which is, in one way or another. And that's what tragedy gives up or doesn't accept in the first place. And so Williams wants to emphasize that, and that would be my criticism of them. But on Hamartia, I think I'm very close to what they're saying. But I understand it very simple-mindedly and very kind of existentially. I just think that, this probably tells you more about me than you need to know. But, what is it to act? What happens when you get in a rage? What happens when you get angry? What acts through you? You're acting at that point. You're angry because something's happened. And in that anger, something speaks through you, some force, which is obviously bound up with the past and is bound up with your kinship structures, right? Which is why the most intense fights will be the fights within a family. Because you scream at each other, right? And you hear nothing, right? That moment, that seems to be what tragedy is identifying. And in the Greek tragedians, but also in Shakespeare, the world of the family and the political world are not separated. They're two aspects of the same substance. So we have this idea of the private and the public, which I think is questionable. What we see is a kind of, you find yourself. I'm sure you've acted badly out there. What happens when you act in a way that you know to be bad? Right? You know, and you still do it. Right? And there's something which is pushing you through that. There's something, and that's what face is for. That's the flaw, as it were. It's something which is, as it were, pushing me through is pushed through from the past, but which I bring down on myself. And tragedy can give us an awareness of that. Can it lead us out of that loop? I hope so. I hope so.